Dear ladies and gentlemen, we're very pleased to see you back to the Kennan Institute lecture series. We have a distinguished scholar and distinguished speaker, and I'm very pleased that Mikhail Minakov, who is back to Ukraine, is with us tonight. He will be speaking on the university's role in Eastern European modernization. Mikhail is a doctor of philosophy. He is an associate professor at the University of Kyiv Academy, where he teaches at the Department of Philosophy and Religion. In 2012-2013, Mikhail has received the Fulbright Scholarship and has spent almost a year in the United States researching at the Woodrow Wilson Center and then at the Harvard University. He is an editor of Ideology and Politics journal. He's also the president of the Ukrainian Kant Society and the president of the Institute for Good Politics. Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's too early. You will judge after the lecture. So today I would like to discuss with you how our reality, our modernity, the era that we live in, the times that we enjoy, how they were created, what was happening, how did we end up with what we have, a modernity that is, in one way, is very interesting period, with very daring democratic projects, with very interesting economic processes, but at the same time so much different from the Western models of modernity. So where is this borderline lying? Is it civilization, as some philosophers say? Is it culture? Is it sociology that can give us an answer? And I think no signal. And I think that the answer is somewhere. Okay. Somewhere there behind this screen. So what I would like to discuss today is how did we create the contemporary world in our part of the world, in Eastern Europe, what we call today Eastern Europe. I think if you imagine a map, well, we don't have a map now, it's hidden there, but if we imagine a map, this European part of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, Moldova, belong to the agglomerate of countries that should, if you could help me. No, everything's fine. No, it's not a movie. So, in a way, if we look at this, you can see that here, okay, in this part of the world, is a group of countries that probably should be named New Eastern Europe. 20 years ago, Eastern Europe was this part. But now, there is a tendency of calling this part of Europe Central. But it's not about names. It's more about how did modernity start and develop in this part of the world. So my major theses are that this era of modernity becomes reality as a number of local projects. These local modernities and multiple modernities, they cover globally entire world. But it has all started from the northwestern peninsula of Eurasia. And by starting the modernization processes, this peninsula became a continent of Europe. And here we have another way of looking at those processes. For example, in many theories and in many positions, there is an idea. May I help you? No? There is an idea that modernization and modernity can exist only in one form, the one that was invented in the West. And it took several centuries for us, actually, to come up with an idea that was articulated by Shmuel Eisenstadt 15 years ago, that there are multiple modernities. So we live in the world of many different modern projects. Well, copied from the Western modernity, in Eastern European context, the university plays an ambivalent role here. Well, university was copied from something that was invented in cultures and societies in Italy, France, England, Germany. But by bringing this model here in these lands, this model started living different life. Well, in terms of modernization, does it help or does it spoil modernization in a way? Well, it supports rationalization in our cultures, but it's definitely creating cadres, those human resources for political systems, for economic systems, that tend to be not that much pro-emancipation, not that much pro-freedom. And in a way, it's the university, the way we constructed university in our societies, it's partially the root cause. So it is part of the cultural mechanism of Eastern European modernity that applies Western ideas, practices, and institutions with local needs, preventing emancipation and the spread of individualization values. So in my idea, our Eastern European modernity is quite different. We developed the modern times, the modern institutions, in a way that copy, in many ways copy, instead of inventing from the grassroots, we copy institutes, but we use them for quite a different purposes than in, let's say, in Western Europe. And university can be a good example of looking at it, how we diverge, how we change the purposes of institutions that we copy. So the big modernization starts from somewhere here and then moves to the rest of the world. And this beginning we should start quite early, in 16th century probably. But when we talk about modernity, we need some definitions, because it's widely used, maybe obsessively used term, and we should look at least in one very short glimpse what it is. So sometimes modernity is described as a cultural project. So from there's this recent terminology proposed by Zygmunt Bauman, from the crystal of tradition to the liquid modernity. So tradition creates such a context, such a cultural context, that tends to not to change for a very long time, while modernity is about moving ahead all the time, up until recently when it became so fast-moving that it is now liquid modernity. Another way of describing modernity is like a social project. So here we have much longer tradition, starting probably from Hegel and Marx to Weber and Adorno, and up until recent social philosophy. And it's basically about several terms like rationalization, make the cultural world, the human world, more rational. Innovation, instead of looking backwards, finding precedents as the basis for our life, we start innovate. We are looking for new ways of doing things. We are about creativity rather than repeating forms. Then we can talk about certain structural dichotomy in modernity proposed by Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas. It's the way they describe the modern project, it's the clear separation of private and public spheres. And numerous problems that we get by separating this public and private domains. Also, using Habermasian theory, we can talk about creation of areas of life world and system, a number of institutions that become so much independent from human actor that start living their own way, while life world is being under constant pressure of the system, and there's this process of colonization of the life world that changes our lives, our human lives, our biographies, in a way that we enjoy less our lives and possible freedoms. At the same time, it's important to remember that modernity is a very contradictory term. First of all, it's never been this clear partition of modernity and traditional or archaic societies. It's always, in a way, intertwined. They always somehow coexist. But the beginning of this coexistence is actually the start of modernization. So, modernity, in spite of its universal claims, becomes reality as a number of local projects, which means that we live in the global situation of multiple modernities. These local modernities started at different times. For northern Italy, France, southern England, and for southern Germany, it's probably 16th century. The impact of those great revelations that were made by Colomb or by Martin Luther, they were changing cultures in a way that had a very strong, very big impact on our lives today. And the logic of those changes were connected with the universal claims of modernity. It means that whichever rules are prepared by modernists, they claim to be equal for all the humans. And it doesn't really matter whether you are Ukrainian or German. It's universal. At the same time, these claims of universal claims and multiple modernities are kind of in a clash. We definitely see a contradiction here. How can universal project become local? Well, Eisenstadt has a good explanation to it. He says that culturally we try to implement these universal claims in our local way. But it's not only geographic differences that we have with the multiple modernities. It's also the moment when we start our local modernities. For example, in the history of Russia, the usual way of describing it, the modernization starts with Peter, the so-called Petrine modernity. At the same time, several years ago, there was a very interesting book, very provocative book, proposed by a group of Western scholars that tells us about pre-Petrine, so 17th century modernity in Russia. And Tsar Alexei as one of the figures of the champions of modernization. That's quite interesting take on it, and we definitely should look even back to Ivan Grozny times and other times. So in a way, suddenly, by studying these complex issues of local modernities, we can see elements of modernizations or false starts quite early in 16th or 17th century. Well, if we look at modernization globally, every epoch it has different stages in a way. So as I said, in 16th century, it was these several events, cultural events, like inventing America, or breaking the church unity. Well, by breaking the church unity, we also invent many interesting forms in political lives. Cuius regio eius religio. Well, in a way, we see how emerge this break with departure from archaic situation. In a way, some European cultures start their dangerous and very interesting process of modernization. A little bit later, for 17th and 18th century, rationality and rationalization becomes a very important message of these early modern projects. And rationalization was described in many terms that philosophers like Descartes or Leibniz were using. They used basically two metaphors: the metaphor of light and metaphor of order. So rationalization or rationality meant bringing light into the darkness of archaic societies and ordering the chaos of these unorganized societies. And these ideas made an impact on also on social forms of life and on political forms, so that in 18th century, by the end of 18th century, we have two huge revolutions. And in a way, we live in the world, at least in politically and socially, the world created by revolutions. Two ones, actually, French and American. They proposed two different ways of doing revolutions, of thinking about revolutions, and up until today, they compete globally. And also, simultaneously, we see how these huge Northern American and Russian projects start in 18th century as modern projects. Well, in 19th century, the strength of those modernizing societies was so big that they managed to actually take over the world. British Empire, French Empire, Russian Empire. They controlled basically all the territories of the world. In 20th century, we see not the spread, but going deeper of modern values. The group of sociologists led by Engelhardt and Welzel managed to describe the 20th century in terms of spread of several values, basically self-realization, or individual values, and rational values, secular rationality. But also this 20th century modernity was the modernity of industrialism. So even the language, the way we think about our societies, was also constructed in a very industrial way. Our political systems and our economic systems were very much under impact. But at a certain moment, when industrialization or industrial way of life started losing its efficiency, it was dropped. And we are the victims of this departure from industrial world. We didn't become the post-industrial society. We moved rather backwards in many ways, like pre-industrial society. But we also definitely left the way we used to live in 20th century, for good or for bad. And now, today, we live in the highly complicated world with many local modernities being at different stages of development. At the same time, we try to find the common language because the ideals of one humanity is still here. If we talk about modernization in our part of the world, you can actually see these centers in 19th century. So the bigger, the darker is the spot here. It's the bigger number of population. And it means that here, this early industrialization was actually very active. So you can see Poland, central Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, and central Russia. In the 17th century, we have many different startups. Well, this fashionable word today in Ukrainian society, startup. Here we can also say that we have many cultural startups that ended up with creation of Orthodox Eastern European empire. But it was still the pre-imperial modernity project, and they aimed at totally different goals. But in 18th century, all these projects were either used as construction bricks for empire, or they were basically destroyed. In 19th century, that was a period of mature imperial and early national projects. The bigger empire was, the more contradictions it had at local level with local cultures. In 20th century, we survived a series of proletarian and national revolutions that ended up in one huge totalitarian but modern project called Soviet Union. And by the end of 20th century, we got a new chance to restart the modernity. Well, the specificity of our modernity is connected, again, with being neighbor to very successful, to very effective, very strong Western European modernity. So in a way, we developed by, instead of inventing and thus becoming modern from the local resources, we were using these models from abroad. We had our own needs for modernization, but we didn't create much of those models. But the first models that we copied are army, church, bureaucracy, and university. So Petrine modernization was very much connected with all of this. But army, Tsar Alexei, in order to fight and to be effective with another early modernizing country, Poland, needed very strong and effective army. The need in army also brought another set of needs in economy and so on and so on. And we suddenly have some ghettos of modernity, like Kukuy, Sloboda in Moscow. And it had its impact on their neighbors, Russian neighbors. In Kyiv, we had our own situation with growing Polish colonization. And here in Kyiv, we also had Polish presence as transmitters of the Western European models. And here and there in the north, these four models were very important and critical. At the same time, here we have our own specificity. It's the key role of state. It's not the local agents that want to use those models, but central government. And in a way, the central government becomes an agent of modernization. This is why here, when we say the word modernization, in Russia, Ukraine, or in Belarus, it will usually mean some technical improvement. Never social. But that's the big thing, because government wanted technical modernization. And of course, it was opposing spread of liberties or freedoms among population. In the study of Stalin's civilization, Terry Martin proposed a very interesting idea. Well, there are two big groups of historians of Soviet culture and Soviet politics in the United States. Well, we can call them modernists and neo-traditionalists. So the modernists think that we should study Soviet civilization, Soviet modern project as modernity, as alternative modernity. And here they have very interesting arguments like what are the motivations of people starting up the Bolshevik state? Freedom, equality, everything that's connected with core modern values. But then the bad guys, like Terry Martin and the rest, they say, oh, wait, but let's see not at motivations, let's look at results. Where do these motivations lead us? To blood? To tyranny? well, suddenly we see that so many neo-traditionalist forms of life appear in this Soviet modernization, the Soviet modern project. So Terry Martin, in one of the books that brought together these two camps, and they had very good and interesting fight between them, then he proposed kind of a paradox, but also solution. He says, we actually should study the Soviet modernity in both terms, modernistic motivations and neo-traditional results. And that's very important, and it gives us very interesting perspective of how we did develop before the Bolsheviks and after them. Also, there's another very interesting recent theory proposed by Alexander Atkind, who described Russian history as history of internal colonization. It's not only colonization of all imperial nations, but the nations that were conquered by the empire, but also the Russians themselves were the object or the subject of colonization from St. Petersburg. So there was a world of modernity, co-present on the same territory, but also there were these territories, ghettos of traditional or archaic world. Well, in a way, that was a very interesting way of showing how specific our modernity is, was made by Griboyedov. He was a participant of the Chechen War, one of the Chechen wars, imperial wars, and he participated in the battle. And after the return of the battle, he writes to someone, to some friend, it's what I see here in Chechnya during, well, imperial and colonial war. It's, and here I cite him, барабанное просвещение против горной дикой вольницы. So it's enlightenment, but it's very strange, military-like enlightenment. And the freedom that actually enlightenment should lead us to is in total opposition to us. It's like wilderness that opposes us by defending liberties. So, in a way, we have very strange, unexpected double effect, double colonization effect. If you remember, I mentioned Habermas and his theory about life world colonization. One system, this number of institutions, autonomous, with their own rules, with their own goals, enter the cultural world that creates, that gives us all the meaning of life. The mother's kiss, the first kiss with the first love, the lullaby, the many other things that kind of very meaningful, but they cannot be ordered, and enlightenment is not needed there. Well, what we have, and when he uses this model of colonization by system of the, when system colonizes the life world, it works well for Western Europe. But if we apply the same model, the same set of ideas to our Soviet experience, post-Soviet experience, we suddenly see that the both parts try to colonize each other. Yes, system goes down and wants to colonize the life world. Melioratia of 1960s, 70s destroyed our wilderness. Well, melioratia means making something better. We got much more fields, very good for agriculture. But, well, it's harder and harder to show a wild animal to your son or a daughter. They just disappeared from our part of the world. Well, that's this impact of, well, one of examples of for the impact of the system. But if we talk about impact of the life world, it's how we apply laws and rules. Suddenly we see that this corrupt system, this system that never can work properly, that is so eager to destroy itself, that is so fragile, that is so inefficient, that actually we have another way of colonization of a system. It's a kind of very strange way around that destroys modernity. Because modernity needs clear separation of private and public spheres, in a way, system and the life world. So that's very important specificity of Eastern Europe. And by saying this, I mean that archaic and modern programs, cultural programs, coexist and cooperate. There's another very interesting term, retro-modernity, that was usually applied for Singapore or some Chinese cities that were modernized very fast in a very short period. But actually, our modernization was also very, very short. So in a way, these archaic and modern programs cooperate in our culture. So, but I would use this archa-modernity, institutionalized archa-modernity, that remains intact in spite of any sort of revolutions. So we had 1917-22 revolution. We had revolution connected to the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991. The huge changes, which didn't actually change a lot in the cultural logic. We just have repetitive cycles of which start with the promise of freedoms, creation of political and economic system, which are so fragile and corrupt that they start declining and disappear. And then we need to go out to just another Maidan and destroy regime and get a new wave of promises for us. Well, this kind of cycles, these are short ones, but actually we can see it also in the history of Soviet Union or pre-Soviet periods. Well, Western modernity, we finally came to university. So Western modernity destroys traditional university and establishes new one. So in a way, university in Middle Ages was a window to rationality, a window to future. But it wasn't the modernizing or modernity model. But as soon as the modernization started, universities played very ambivalent role. In some ways, they created those guys who were the champions of modernity. But they also created community that was eager to believe what was previously invented without innovations. So in 18th century, there's this process of changing, modernizing the model, the very model of university in Germany, in France, up until the moment when the French Revolution takes place. And here we see very strange move. French Revolution, one of the major acts of French Revolution was the closure of Sorbonne. The university is dismissed. Instead, there's this very technical Napoleonic approach to creation. Schools with very direct, with very utilitarian goals. At the same time, the Germans have saved university by modernizing it more and more, up until the moment when Fichte and Humboldt actually proposed some interesting model, which probably was very sexy to many other governments in the world, and they started duplicating this type of universities around the world. This Humboldtian model was the first one, the first universal model that was used in many other cultures. Here in Eastern Europe, this application of universities model was proposed by government. The government was the champion of creation and development of universities. But by saying this, I disregard the experiment proposed by Petrus Movila, Petro Mohila, who actually created here in Kyiv a college that was very important for the modernization of entire Eastern Europe. I'm talking about Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Well, you know that in several weeks we're going to celebrate the 400th anniversary. So 4 centuries this institution was present in our culture and made its impact on rationalization or ideologization of our lives. So anyway, in this pre-imperial period, when we had several startups, the idea of Kyiv Mohyla was very important and brought from the Polish Jesuit set of models. And already in 18th century, a century after Mohyla proposed his model, we can see that the Moscow University and the later universities that appeared in early 19th century, they share the same set of characteristics. Well, first of all, a university is not a separate corporation, but a part of government. It's more like a tool. So when in 1804, Alexander I creates this all-imperial structure of universities, 7 universities, 7 educational districts, university was part of government. And university was not only about science and education, it was also about management of schools, gymnasiums, and so on and so on. Another characteristic is acceptance of government-led emancipation from, but not emancipation for. That was this tricky thing that if government leads the modernization, then the language of freedom is not really part of the educational system. Usually this emancipation values and models were created outside of university, unlike 19th century Europe. Well, and the third characteristic is limited role in scientific inquiry and reoccurring split between university as educational system and academy as separate research institution. That's very interesting that anyway, Khrushchev was repeating the model that was invented like in mid-19th century in Moscow. So this pattern is actually there in these cycles of development in our modernity. So once again, we copied university as a Western model for local needs. What does Kyiv Mohyla Academy meant? Well, we have a new wave, very efficient wave of education provided by Jesuits in interests of the Catholics and the Polish crown. In order to oppose the Catholicization, the Orthodox communities in Polish Kingdom or Republic, Rzeczpospolita, started creating their own schools. Well, here in Kyiv, we got Bratska school created in 1615. Due to Halshka Holovichivna, you know the story. But the school is not yet university. It's not college. And here, the alumnus of Lviv school and brave general and a smart monk, Petro Mohyla, comes up with an idea of creating a college here in Kyiv that would create effective defenders of the Orthodox case. Well, Petro Mohyla had his own very interesting model in mind. He wanted to create a church and a university or college that would be autonomous from political structures. He didn't want this government to be the sole champion of modernization. This autonomy is very important. This idea was ruined later, but the first and the second generation of Mohylianids partially supported this idea. We can see how how it was developing up until end of 18th century. Well, in this wave of Polish Counter-Reformation and the spread of Jesuit college model, here in the south, it's the so-called southern channel of modernization in educational institutions. But what was very important here is the fact that these colleges had very strong ideological meaning. They had to prepare elites, well, either dedicated to the Catholic case or to the Orthodox case. And these colleges didn't have many faculties. They were basically, if you go through them, you end up as church personality. Later, in the third generation of Mohylianids, we see how this Orthodox case becomes very important. And one of the alumni and rectors of Kyiv Mohyla, Feofan Prokopovich, becomes a champion of imperial age, of imperial project. He's a co-author together with Piotr I, Peter I. They work together on creating this huge Orthodox empire. Well, there was also this northern route or northern channel of modernization, basically bringing the northwestern models from Netherlands, from Germany, into Russia. And also Swedish experience was very important, because Sweden at that moment was not only the major enemy to emerging Russian empire, but also a local superpower. And of course, the models that were there, they were very important for the Eastern Europeans. So, in a way, the Moscow University and Academy of Sciences, they were models copied from the West Northern cultures in Europe. Well, this Petrine modernity is connected with the idea that he should create a university. Well, he dies without creating it. He managed to create academy, several very important schools, but the project of university was there. In order to start something up, he proposed to the college, to Kyiv Mohyla Academy, the status of university. So we're getting several gramota to have Kyiv Mohyla as university. At the same time, it's a university with one faculty only. Well, Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg had a limited number of students, but this project with students disappeared in several years after the death of Peter. There was another attempt to create university by the mid-18th century. The group of intellectuals managed to create a Moscow university. And again, it was a trade-off. Government versus intellectuals, they come up with a project, but government was, in a way, leading these talks. Government needed some educated cadres to run the huge empire, the growing empire, better. In 19th century, we already see how this university model is being reinvented in Russian Empire. Experiments of Alexander I, they're connected with this creation of 7 universities. It was a very slow process. For example, we say that the Karazin University in Kharkiv started in 1804. But actually, this university started, well, more or less effectively, they started working in 1814. So 10 years they needed to create library, to get the building, well, infrastructure, basic infrastructure. So the first half of 19th century, Russian Empire, Eastern Europe, is creating those infrastructural processes, infrastructural spots. At the same time, we already had here on the Polish lands, in Vilno, also in Derbt, Yuriev, two old universities that were created before the empire. Well, that or the other way, these European universities didn't really make a very big impact on this imperial university in Russian Empire, because Russian Empire was looking mostly at England and Sweden. And actually what Alexander I made, he copied in a way this experiment that the Swedish kings made with Uppsala University. In 1770s, there was a moment when government of Sweden created a university with 5 faculties corresponding to 5 ministries. So basically, the idea was that, yes, we have this continuation of government. Some departments of government, like these sub-ministries, provide us with very well-trained young people who can work effectively in the government. And this idea was probably very supportive to Alexander, the way he wanted to see educational process in Russia. Well, there was also a set of experiments during Nicholas I's reign. Here we see already a very rich educational and scholarly life. We have academies, universities developing, but also he started making emphasis on воспитательную работу, this educating youth into patriots, educating youth into imperial, homo imperialis. Well, it's very interesting. There are several researches and books dedicated to the way why they had to have uniform, or how the whipping was important part of this education, how this the life in student hostels was very important part of the education. So in many ways, Nicholas I era was very rich in these pedagogical experiments with the youth. Alexander II was also very much involved with different results into educational, into the university construction. The Novorossiysk University in Odessa was created during his reign. But even during Alexander II period and with the later Tsars, this contradiction was already there. Young, educated people strive for emancipation, strive for freedoms. And government had to invent new tools how to control these champions of education and how to change the educational system to not to create the enemies of the Tsar. And this contradiction was never solved, so we got very active participation of students and also professors into revolutionary processes in early 20th century. And after those huge changes that were brought with the revolution in 1917-22, we see the period like a decade of the Bolshevik experimentations. Well, most of the universities are closed. Those that survived, they were renamed into different types of institutions, like Universitet of the Red Professura, or things like that. Or in 1926, 1927, there was the so-called proletarization of educational institutions. So kids of professors lost their right to study. It's only proletariat and the peasants that could have an access to educational system. But also there was a rule that if a student is very good at study, he can be named as a professor, as a red professor, in a couple of years. That was a like promotion of proletarian cadres. And the success of these institutions was measured by the number of those red professors. So imagine that this old-fashioned imperial professor with good education and good manners cooperate with someone who 3 years ago was still a worker. And it creates many contradictions from within. The quality of education, quality of training, especially professional training, was dropping down, so that a Stalinist revolution between 1928 and 1933, these 5 years that made Soviet Union, well, that was the revolution, the Stalinist revolution, and made Soviet Union to be a different country than it was in, say, 1924. Educational part was very important. Yuri Mitin was charged by, Yuri Mitin himself wasn't an educated person, but he was already academic. Stalin gave him a special mission to study why this new generation of Soviet engineers is so deficient in terms of industrialization. Well, among many different findings of the commission led by Yuri Mitin, they realized that this early promotion of smart kids is not that good. So probably education should take much longer process. Also, the kids of professura, of intelligentsia, have got the right to study in universities once again. Also, the idea of Mitin's commission was to create the united system of universities, professional institutes, and academies of science. So the system that was destroyed by the Bolsheviks started reappearing, and the imperial models were very much used. But also, this was the period when the Stalinist surrounding was looking at Western Europe and United States to see which models, university models, was working better there. Well, another wave of experiments was in Khrushchev era. He was the one who finally created the contemporary Ukrainian system when universities do not teach young people how to be a scholar. He made a clear cut between Academia Nauk and university. And up until today, Ukrainian system is based on this principle, destruction of the field of knowledge. Also, Gorbachev had this period, a very short period, but very inventive in terms of university lives and models. And that was the period of emancipation and democratization of the internal life of universities. So that in early 90s in Ukrainian universities we also had this early period of freedoms, which then were taken by the bureaucrats, and Ministry of Education reconstructed its empire. So this contemporary, very anti-modernist, very demodernizing strength of the Ministry of Education is preserved. It functions well only in destruction of science, only in not giving an opportunity to create a new wave, a new generation of champions of modernization, social political modernization, so that we always need alumni from abroad. And there's always this fight of the system with these alumni. So we get interesting cadres coming from Western universities, but if you look attentively, during these 25 years of our independence, how far, how deep they were involved into our society. They were always like foreigners, even though they have family names like Ivanenko, Petrov, but they are foreigners in this system, and they can find a good career only in business, only in private sector. The public sector is closed for them. Well, this stable set of characteristics connected with the post-Soviet and Soviet universities is, of course, acceptance of university as a part of government, as a state's tool to create a good patriot, and so on and so on, but less and less so about professionalism. And, of course, these ideas, these skills to be a scholar are not part of this agenda, of course. Acceptance of government-led emancipation forms and limited role in scientific inquiry that has this reoccurring split between university and Akademia Nauk. So my conclusions is that university is one of the tools for human resources of Eastern European modernity. We need universities. At the same time, the quality of the product is always questionable. Our states try to remain a unique agent of modernization with universities' support. The recent case, recent example, this порядок присвоєння вчених звань. So professor and docent, it's business of government. It's not about university. If you look at the criteria for the selection, it's these previous successes without any hint that there is a future in science in our part of the world. So in a way, these indicators that were approved several weeks ago, they just show that bureaucrats want to rule further. They rule for 2.5 centuries in this part of the world, and they are not eager to let scholars be independent. Power elites are formed by governmental universities, and they deny the change of model. At critical moments, the model reproduces itself through its own alumni. Well, and this is actually why we have that problematic integration with global educational and scientific networks. So, in a way, we live in this post-Soviet retro-modernity where modern forms of life coexist with very traditional forms of life. These demodernization processes are taking more and more impact on our society. And pre-modern, pre-industrial at least, pre-industrial forms of life take more and more power in our society. But we still have this chance for the second modernity. That was proposed by several philosophers and sociologists. And this chance says, well, it's never late to start building the new future, the contemporary state, the contemporary economic system, and the contemporary society. Thank you. Questions?
Not been a prophet in your own country, but still, how positive are your prognoses for Ukraine, considering all what you have said just now?
Well, in our system, we have several champions that are, in a way, part of the system, but also make an impact on that system to change. Kyiv Academy and Ukrainian Catholic University. These are two agents of change. System is very strong, and inertia of system is far more stronger than the capacity of these two universities to change much. But still, they provide our political class and economic class with cadres that think differently, but who are still not foreigners. They are not from foreign universities. So in a way, this Bruchavetsky experiment with Ukrainian society is in many ways very successful. Kyiv exists for 23 years now, this reborn Kyiv Academy. This is actually a very, very strong message to the entire society that we can develop. Well, we will see, though, in 10 years, which projects survived. So far, it was Kyiv and Catholic University in Lviv that managed to survive even the worst times of non-free regimes in Ukraine or economic collapses. But again, my optimism is very limited because we don't have enough elements, from, at least in the educational system, to change. Ministry of Education is really very strong institution that reconstructs itself, that changes whoever comes in the place of minister or deputy minister, changes the language, also body language, in several months. This is inevitable change. That's how system works. This is how this institutional inertia works with us, poor humans.
Можна українською?
Так.
Так. Ну, ви назвали два основні гравці, які сприяють модернізації. Одразу згадала про Києво-Могилянську академію, яка повставала на противагу католизації, тобто релігійний фактор, католицький університет, теж за назвою і так далі. Теж якийсь є феномен зв'язку з релігією, так, повстання цих двох університетів. Як ви можете це пояснити з точки зору наших соціальних реалій, чи це не випадково, тобто ваша якась така думка щодо пояснення. І друге, теж говорили про міністерство як потужну інституцію, яка взагалі вже змінює людину і таке інше. Тобто, як ви особисто оцінюєте, тому що Сергій Квіт є фактично виходцем середовища Могилянської академії, чи він вже є заручником системи і дійсно він не може здійснити вплив на систему зсередини? Тобто, ваше ставлення до посади міністра, чи він взагалі має можливості в цій системі, можливо, в кооперації з зовнішнім середовищем здійснювати якісь впливи, може не системні, але якісь такі накопичувальні?
Well, what we can see that Ministry of Education right now tries to do some reform, and I think that this reform goes in the wrong direction. Whatever they do, it increases the power of the bureaucrats. Although the norms, the ideas that Minister Kviit and his team have, well, I share and support those aims, but the result, it's like Terry Martin's paradox. We have very modernistic motivations, but the result is very different than we expected, neo-traditional. You can judge it, for example, the key element of the reform was this quality assurance agency that Minister Kviit promoted. But as soon as this almost independent part of ministry was created, bureaucrats took over, and minister had to cancel reform. This is how system works. We want to create something, and suddenly the result of what we wanted to reach are very different. So, it's well, as a representative of Kyiv-Mohyla, and the entire team is very much Mohylanit in a way, in spirit. I still don't see any big or optimistic result there. I still find that autonomous groups of scholars and students are the real drivers of real modernization, not ministry. So the only result that I would expect from Minister Kviit or some other reformer there is destruction of ministry, so in a way that it would never be able to recreate itself. That's one thing. The second, the major question that you asked about religion, role of religion with these university models. Well, here I skipped that periodization, but there was a moment when modern nations, modern big groups had to somehow organize themselves. And they were organized in political and religious terms, so that religious identity was the key identity, dominating identity. And in 18th century, in 18th, 17th century, it was the key identity. And the clash of these identities provoked creation of institutions that would support them both. So here, we see how Kyiv-Mohyla is being created, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy is being created in the times when the new clergy was needed. Since the Berestia Union basically took away all the institutional resources of the Orthodox Church. All the hierarchs, or the majority of hierarchs of the clergy, left for the Unia. And it was basically these Svitski Bratstva that were in opposition to Unia. And these Svitski Bratstva were autonomous groups of citizens united by their religious identity, confessional identity, and they were thinking in terms how to empower themselves. And universities were very important. So this is how the old Kyiv Mohyla was constructed. With Catholic University, it's a different story. It's a postmodern story. It's late modernity and a minority group living in Ukraine, in majority, in the Orthodox majority, in the Orthodox society. And they needed, for their community, for their minority, a very strong educational institute. But at the same time, the idea of creators of Catholic University is very brave and noble. They made it for their community and for the rest of Ukraine, urbi et orbi. So they really go out. And my personal experience in Catholic University is amazing. It's a very good place. It's a very good environment for a scholar. And my Mohylianite identity sometimes is very jealous, because sometimes I feel more cozy there than in my own environment. Yes, please.
Ну, это если помечтать, типа фантазировать. Вот у нас уже технологии как бы есть достаточные, чтобы сделать, я не знаю, мировой университет, где мы бы не зависели от государства и так далее. То есть вот Гарвард, он же частный, у него финансирование больше, чем у всего федерального уровня в России по образованию. И можно было бы дать доступ как бы всем желающим как бы слушать лекции. То есть там же профессора, они маленькую только часть уделяют именно самому лекциям и так далее. Они заняты именно research и как бы новыми знаниями. То есть объединенными усилиями сделать какой-то новый, независимый от стран, правительств, религий, вообще всего университет, доступный всем.
Well, we actually have it, Coursera, for example.
Well, it's very small now.
Well, yes, I agree. Or Open University that exists for over 15 years. But, well, first of all, resources. Do you have enough money? Do you have enough students able to pay for this sort of university? We have our own inertia, cultural inertia. And in Open University, you can study some technical or managerial skills. But will you get a course in Ukrainska literatura, in Ruskая literatura? A good one. Can you really discuss with professor some stresses in Byron's poetry? I mean, humanities and social sciences, it's not only about professional skills, it's something else. It's this sort of very tacit competences. And here we come to the moment when these foreign universities could not respond to the local need. So local modernities need local agents, also in education and science. In a way, I believe that those foreigners, well, our kids who go abroad, study there and come back, they can create some centers of excellence, autonomous groups that would not give a heck about government, that would try to establish contacts with economic players, and then create these more universities than just two ones, like Kyiv Mohyla and Catholic University. Although at the same time, you can see how our economic agents are reluctant to think in terms of future. They have very short-term strategies, and in these terms, well, in these short terms, they just don't need us, universities. So, in many ways, Ukraine is in a very bad and a good position. We can start something. We have enough cadres to do it, but we don't have, well, we have human resources, but we don't have financial resources, and we don't have cultural resource. We don't have many success stories in educational sphere, except for Kyiv Mohyla and for Catholic University. We don't have many successes. At the same time, these two universities are not the research universities yet, at least. Well, I hope in Kyiv Mohyla we will succeed in this. But Ukraine, 40 million nation, needs like 10 times more good universities. I think we have enough resources for 15 to 20 universities. And that's enough. Well, we don't need to have more, but we need to have not less than 15. Those 200 something that we have, it's of course imitation of educational process. And again, there are stories, sad stories from our former partners in Soviet Union, Baltic countries. You can see how their universities, how they get deeper and deeper in a very strange crisis. So they are members of EU. They are members, these universities are part of the international global educational networks. But just because they are part of these networks, they have less and less students willing to stay at postgraduate level in these universities. They prefer, it's much easier to go to England to study, or to Poland, or to Germany, than to remain, let's say, in Vilnius. And here, well, for us, post-Soviets, the Baltic countries were the places where we would expect the paradise, well, also scientific paradise to bloom. But no, it's not the case. So probably we should learn lessons of the Baltic countries as well and try to find out a better way of entering those networks, but also being present in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian society, and changing this society into becoming more equal, more free, and more cozy, comfortable in a way.
Ну, в Литві, напевно, все одно ситуація краща, а, наприклад, Україна і Білорусь. Якщо ви досліджували там атмосферу, чи можемо похизуватися, що в нас ходять два?
Well, if we compare ourselves with Turkmenistan...
Ми говоримо про пострадянські країни, так?
Yes.
Ми, якби, є
Well, we can compare ourselves with worse examples, of course. But why? What would be the outcome for this?
Ні, щоб зробити висновки, які є причини недоліків.
No, in Belarus, there's no big successes so far. They just preserved the Soviet university in more or less pure form. No. There was a very interesting experiment, the so-called Minsk Humanities University, but I think it was 2005 when they emigrated to Lithuania. They couldn't stay in Belarus.
The dictatorship doesn't need smart people.
Exactly. And the worst example is Turkmenistan. Even libraries are closed. We are not talking here about universities. Okay, I think we are done for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.